Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. Today, we are welcoming Schneider Electric for our topic, Better Energy Decisions for the Field. My name is Madeline No, I'm from NetHope, and before we get started, let's just go over a few housekeeping details for our webinar today. We like to keep this session interactive. Please use the Zoom chat window for our Q&A and discussion session at the end of the session. Just post your questions there and we'll get to those toward the end of the hour. Also, we'll follow up with all of you with an email that includes a link to the recording and the collateral for the session today. It will be also posted on the NetHope Solutions Center. And we also appreciate your input on all of our sessions. We'll post a link to a webinar satisfaction poll in the chat window toward the end of the session, and we would appreciate your feedback very much. Now I'll hand it off to my colleague Duncan Drury to get things started.
Hi there, welcome everybody to this webinar, part of NetHope's new alternative energy work stream. Very excited to have John Graham from Schneider Electric to talk to us today. As we all know, without electricity, we don't get very far with digital or lots of other activities, and this is particularly acute in field sites run by organisations such as NetHope members. So yeah, very excited to hear from John, who's got quite a long background helping different organisations work with electricity, get electricity more reliable and better quality in the field in lots of different locations, particularly Africa. So yeah, hand over to John. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Madeline, I'll just take control, I think, now, if I can. Okay. While that's going on, hello everybody. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this webinar today. I hope it's going to be useful for you. My name is John Graham. I work at Schneider Electric in our Access to Energy team. In business development, I am responsible for Anglophone Africa and the Middle East zones, and I have colleagues occupied with Francophone Africa, South America, Asia, India, Asia Pac, in access to energy as well. So before I really get into the access to energy part, I'd like to, I think I've got control. I'm just trying to move to the next slide, Madeline. I'm not sure what's going on here. Hang on. Okay.
Let's
Madeline,
try that again. Hang on.
Sorry. If not, I can share my desktop if it's easier.
All right. Would you like me to move the slides along? I can do that.
Yeah, if you go to the next slide then please, Madeline, that'd be great. Okay, so just an overview, quick overview of Schneider Electric. For those of you who don't know Schneider Electric, we are a global specialist in energy management and automation. Our annual revenues are around 25 billion euros per year. We employ around 160,000 people in over 100 countries. So we really are a global presence. You can see that we're in pretty much every geography and it's pretty balanced. Interestingly, in the last 5 to 10 years, the rest of the world activities have grown quite significantly for us. And the important figure on this slide really is that we are continually innovating in terms of products and solutions, but also in terms of business models. We reinvest every year around 5% of our overall revenue back into R&D activities. Next slide, Madeline, please. And as a global specialist of energy management, we believe that access to energy is a basic human right. We cannot call ourselves a specialist in energy management if we ignore the people on the planet that don't have access to energy. Next slide, please, Madeline. And the big question is how do we provide energy access to people who don't have any energy access? Today, there's around 1 billion people who don't have access to energy at all. There's another 3 billion that have got some access, but they're using fossil fuels, which are unsafe, unhealthy. And these people are spending around 30% of their revenue on these types of unsafe and polluting energies. So there's still another billion people plus the 3 billion using unsafe. So it's over half the world's population. Next slide, please. So our challenge is that we want to make sure everyone on the planet has got access to reliable, safe, and importantly, sustainable energy. And that is one of the key pillars of access to energy, which I'll come on to in a minute. Next slide, please. So to dig a little bit deeper into access to energy at Schneider, this program was started on the direction of our CEO back in 2009. And it had its roots even earlier than that. And we approach access to energy through 3 main pillars. The first pillar is through offers and business models. So we've got a portfolio of products and solutions which we can join together or have independently in order to give energy access. And around that, we create through partners, through different partners, through communities, through financing organisations, through NGO organisations, through government and non-governmental organisations, business models where we create value, where we create sustainability around access to energy. The second pillar is our investment fund. We have an investment fund where we invest in generally small startup companies that are in either sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, or South America. Companies that are doing something interesting around the access to energy space, something that we wouldn't necessarily be focusing on at the moment. They might have a fantastic distribution network. They might have some new technology that they're trialing. And we invest in them very much like our venture capitalists would. We invest for a few years. We look to grow that investment. We look to help them grow their business through our advice and expertise. And then at some point in time, we part ways amicably and they carry on growing their business. And the third pillar, which is really, really important, is the vocational training. And in fact, the training elements was the first part of the Access to Energy program to be launched. And the reason it's so important is that we believe, and if you want to make anything sustainable, you've got to have local skill set. You've got to have local entrepreneurs or expertise with people who are using energy, safe, clean, reliable energy, in a way to create socio-economic development. So we partner with public bodies, public universities, training colleges, training centres, as well as private organisations, Don Bosco, for example, and we supply didactic equipment on the one hand for people to be able to use or to be able to train on how to use electricity safely and how to work with electricity safely. So we train young people, generally young people who've come from either underprivileged backgrounds or for whatever reason have missed out on formal education. And we train them in electrical skills, and in parallel or we also offer training in entrepreneurial skills, because we know that if we train entrepreneurs and they start businesses and they know how to start and run a business, that they will use energy in the correct way to run their business. They've got reliable energy, and therefore they will be able to again add to that socio-economic development. Okay, next slide, please, Madeline. Now I've given you an overview of Schneider and access to energy at Schneider. I'd like to take a bit more of a dive into the humanitarian and NGO context. So next slide, please, Madeline. I'd like to kick off with a few questions. And these are questions that I hear, and I hear all the time, and I've heard at various conferences. And these are all really good questions. It's, we want to move to greener solutions or more sustainable solutions. How do we stop using our generators? How do we make this move to renewables? How many? And the other thing I hear a lot is we actually don't know how many generators we're using today. We don't know what our fuel costs are, because these fuel costs are hidden in amongst other things that aren't in our reporting cycle. Next thing I hear a lot is, how do we take? How do we take the headache out of energy provision for our humanitarian operations and program activities? why we should be able to focus on our core activities, why are we having to worry about energy provision? We have to have energy to do our core activities, but it's a headache for us. And what about our funding and project cycles? How do we procure high quality and reliable solutions? How do we assess our energy needs? And how do we control our energy usage? And who's going to support this? Who's going to support this? If we make this move to renewable, who's going to be there locally that can offer the after-sale service for us? Who can we go to? How can we be sure that they're going to be there in 5 years' time if we have a problem? And then the big question for us, which I've already touched on, is how can we make our energy economically sustainable? How can we put in something in place that's still going to be running in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Okay. Next slide, please, Madeleine. So just to touch a bit on the funding and project cycles and energy itself. What I see is, from my experience, is that most humanitarian or NGO activities is generally on a short-term funding cycle, less than 5 years, and this usually means that the project durations are similar in span or in scope. On top of that, there is a yearly budget. There's generally yearly budgets, which makes it very difficult for any kind of high capex project or investment. And then there's the other question, you know, if you buy a renewable, who owns the asset at the end of it? What do you do with that asset? These three factors really point towards choosing a diesel generator or a diesel genset, because, well, I'll come on to the reasons later, but it's very short term. It's very easy to pick up a diesel generator. You know, the initial capex is low. Now, if we want to move to renewables, we have to change our way of thinking, and we need to look at different models to how we fund these things, and models to fit the funding constraints that the actors in the field who are doing the work have. We can look at things like energy as a service, and this means that energy as a service where you can focus on your core competencies and not worry about the energy. There's a service provider that's giving you energy. We can look at energy procurement over long term. So we have options, you know, through financing, through lease to buy, lease in perpetuity, where you eventually you just are on a long-term lease, and where you can also build up an asset pool of renewable resources. Much like if you would go and procure 2,000 or 1,000 Toyota Hiluxes for your field activities today, you would buy a standard Toyota Hilux. You would have a pool of Hiluxes. You would have a pool of spare parts. You would just use them everywhere. So you know that you've got, once somebody's been trained on maintenance and support, they can do that wherever they are in the field. Next slide, please, Madeline. Now, moving on to energy needs assessment. I've been hearing this a lot at the moment, or in recent months this year, particularly in the NGO community, where we're saying, okay, well, if we're going to move to renewables, how do we know what energy we need? And one of the challenges we've got with gensets and diesel generators, because we don't know how many assets we've got in the field, we also don't know how much fuel we're burning. So it's difficult to say how much energy is being used on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got this all-you-can-eat fossil fuel model where generators are put in place, everyone's just plugging in whatever they want, they're using energy however they want, and there's no kind of monitoring or control or understanding about energy efficiency. So in terms of needs assessment, you know, needs assessment's never been done for generators. There's two main types that I see, and the first one is a simple type, and it's based on auditing the equipment being used in the installation or wherever you are, and this can be done by either a questionnaire or a site visit. And I've worked with some partners of ours to create these questionnaires, and it's based then on a hypothesis of usage and load profile based on these questionnaires plus our previous experience with project data. And as such, it's constantly evolving and improving. And we can build in an expansion or a margin during the calculation. Now, before I go to advantages and disadvantages, if I move across to the complex one, what this is we install monitoring equipment at each site. Okay, each site that we're interested in moving towards renewables, we put monitoring equipment in. Now, in order to do this properly, you've got to have the equipment in place for several weeks and months to build up an accurate load profile. So you're doing real-time data collection and analysis. So the advantages of the monitoring equipment is obviously it's very accurate data and you get a very nice load profile. Whereas the advantages on the simple questionnaire or site visit based one is it's cheap, it's very fast. You can validate it after the installation. That sounds a bit ironic, but based on the other data that we've got and expansion, it becomes advantageous. And the volume, because the data volume that we have already, it builds confidence in what our hypotheses are. And we can also validate via monitoring and control. Now, disadvantage of the simple system is obviously where there is a larger room per error. It's reliant on good base data and it's reliant on observation. If we move across to the disadvantage on the complex needs assessment, it's very expensive in terms of time and money. It takes a long time if you've got to leave equipment in place for, even if it's for just a week or two at several sites. You've either got to have a big pool of this equipment or you've got to keep moving it around, which means sending people to site. You've got to make sure you connect to every single piece of equipment. There's also the human behavioural factor, I call it. People generally, it's kind of human consciousness that if you realise that you're being monitored about something, you tend to change your behaviour. So sometimes it may not be as accurate as you think it is, especially when we've been in this situation where people have had all-you-can-eat fossil fuel models. It might be a sudden awakening. They think, oh, they're monitoring us now. We better turn the lights out when we go at the end of the day. So there's two sides to this approach. There's not one better method than the other. I just wanted to explain the differences as I see them today. So next slide, please, Madeline. So if we now talk about energy demand and control of energy, I've already talked about some of the bad habits that we've got from using diesel generators. I say bad habits, it's probably a bit of a strong term, but in most cases, because of this all-you-can-eat model, there isn't a value attached to energy. There's generally no payment, there's no conservation of energy, and there's no control on consumption. So therefore, there's no responsibility or there's no accountability to it. And as I said earlier, in terms of accounting, finance accounting terms, generally all of this fuel usage is pooled into one pot, which makes it very difficult to dissect. Same for the actual asset itself in the generators. So how do we move away from this all-you-can-eat kind of model into to be more energy efficient? And I think the first thing is obviously, and I know with Unitil we've been talking about this a lot. There's the training and education. Training and education is a big part of it, so people understand what energy means, what it costs to produce energy, what it would mean if you didn't have energy, how we can be more energy efficient, etc., etc. And then there's the monitoring and control. Our solutions allow you to not only monitor energy usage, but also to control it. So you can control critical and non-critical loads. So for example, in a hospital scenario or a health clinic scenario, your critical loads there are obviously your fridges and your operating theatre. So you've got to make sure that you've got energy available for them at all times. So what you can do is you can monitor that, and as soon as you hit a certain threshold in storage or whatever, you can start cutting non-critical loads in other locations. The other thing, which is really obvious, but we've all been in the context, is energy efficient appliances. Move away from halogen bulbs to LED bulbs is the simplest thing. You can cut your energy consumption on lighting by about 80 or 90% just by doing that. There's metering options available, so that we can, for example, in staff quarters or things like that, we can throttle or the power based on current usage. so that people can't connect too many things at once to the grid or to the microgrid to prevent overloading or prevent deep discharge. We can have it on time-based, usage-based. We can also have a solution mix, which I'll come on to in a minute. And the next slide, I'm going to talk about anchor loads and sustainability. So next slide, please, Madeline. So yeah, I touched on this several times about the sustainability aspect. And in order to make energy sustainable or energy provision sustainable, it has to be a shared investment. And when I say shared investment, I'm not only talking about financial investment. We have to engage the communities. And I'm not just talking about the community in an African village, for example. I'm talking about the community as a whole. All of the partners and stakeholders that are involved in energy provision, whether it be the NGO, the end community, the finance partner, Schneider Electric, okay, and any other partners that we're bringing in, the governments, etc. We have to have a shared investment. We have to have a sense of ownership in the energy provision and energy usage. That way, there is more chance of having energy conservation and energy efficiency. If I talk about anchor loads, we have obviously NGO-funded activities in operations and program activities, whereby there is a definitive load that is funded, that can be funded, and then around that we can have other activities. Any spare power that is available, we can through training programs and through the NGO programs, we can train people up to do entrepreneurial activities via agribusinesses, small to medium enterprises, etc. We can then also have, around that, we can have a solution mix where we have an energy hub, which could be a microgrid. And then for secondary loads, we can use metering, and we can even, into local indigenous communities, we can use pay-as-you-go solar home systems, so that we can monitor, we can control, we can collect small amounts of revenue. If there's a revenue collection behind, what we found is that there is responsibility and there is a value associated with that energy. And all these things together lead to a shared value creation. And that in turn promotes local socio-economic development. And we can create value chains that we either envisage at the time or that develop on their own. There's a little drawing off to the right here where you can see, in provision of key services, in provision of these small to medium entrepreneurs, and also the community itself. And if we collect small amounts of revenue, or we have partial funding, it means that we can reinvest in the training, we can reinvest in the community, and we can create something that is truly sustainable without long-term continuous investment. So next slide, please, Madeline. Now, excuse me, I just need to take a sip of water. If we talk about renewables, renewable energies, and we talk about quality, these are all questions: safety, installation, support, sizing of the solution. I'd like to show you the next slide, and I think you'll all agree that what we're going to see on the next slide is typical, and we've all seen similar situations. So next slide, please, Madeline. This is what we see in the field. This was operations of an international NGO, where they'd already had a solar installation put in for a few years. And what we saw is poor cabling. If you see the picture at the center there at the top, wires spliced together using insulating tape, improperly sized cables, or thin cables joining to thicker cables. We've got the battery bank directly underneath the inverters and the charge controllers. They're behind a metal mesh cage, which you think is sufficient, but then you've got somebody who's working right next to that, and they're putting papers and paper clips on top so anything can drop through the gaps. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a picture there of one of the staff quarters where another small solar installation, and directly underneath all the electrical equipment, somebody or the people there are using it as food preparation. The batteries themselves, this was, I think, the third set of batteries that were installed there. That had been procured at the lowest cost possible, I believe. They were improperly installed and connected, not properly sized. And I strongly suspect that they weren't even new batteries when they were bought. And they'd lasted approximately 6 months from installation. Then on the right-hand side, that solar installation had 25, if I remember rightly, around 25 solar panels on the roof, on a corrugated tin roof. And you can see there, the top right photo, we've got bare wires exposed against a metal roof, which means that around 70% of those solar panels were either completely burnt out or only producing very small amounts of energy. And obviously there was the fire risk associated with it. You can see the photo there with my finger pointing at that brown patch on that solar panel. That's showing burnout between cells. That means at least those 2 rows of cells are completely inactive. Okay, and I'm sure, as I said, I'm sure all of us have seen similar situations, and this is why there's a lot of pushback on renewables. It's about having that competency and having that understanding and being sure about safety, about earthing, about short circuit control, etc., etc. And this is just the installation. Obviously, you know, we've got the same challenges with genset installations as well, similar challenges. But there's generally more competency around gensets locally, or people that you can find a mechanic generally. So, excuse me, Madeline, next slide, please. So, having spoken about various different aspects of energy assessment and funding cycles and what we see in the field when we try to move to renewables, I'd like to talk to you about a bit more about one of Schneider Electric's offers that we've specifically developed for the humanitarian and NGO sector, and it's called Vilaya, is the range. If you move to the next slide, Madeline, and in particular, I'd like to talk to you about Vilaya containerized microgrids. So Schneider Electric has developed this solution specifically. We actually developed it in conjunction with UNHCR, in conjunction with their needs. So next slide. And there are 2 types of Vilaya containerized microgrid. There is Vilaya Emergency on the left-hand side, or Vilaya Community on the right-hand side. Vilaya Emergency and Community both share the same containerized solution. They come in either 10 or 20 feet containers, depending on the size. Vilaya, all the power control systems, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, are in the container. But Vilaya Emergency comes with these retractable, foldable solar panels. Those solar panels all fold flat, and they can be put inside the container. The container doors can be opened up, and they can be put inside the container and transported. The advantage of this is, in scenarios like refugee camps, often in refugee camps, you're not allowed to put any kind of permanent installation on the ground, which is why a lot of refugee camps use gensets. This solution enables you to put the solar panels back into the container, pick it up and move it somewhere else. So it's not classified as a permanent structure. It's also fantastic in humanitarian relief scenarios. If you have a scenario where you know you're going to have a hurricane's going to come through, and that's forecasted, what you can do is you can put the container there beforehand, close the doors with the solar panels. Once the hurricane's gone past, you can open the doors, roll out the solar panels, and you can be up and running. So it gives you this mobility option. On the other hand, Vilaya Community, we understand that there's some instances where movable containers and movable solar panels aren't needed. For example, in program or operations activities, in terms of rural electrifications, communications, schools, education, small business activities, hospitals, maternity, etc., etc., whereby you're going to have a permanent installation, and it makes more sense and it's more economic sense to have the solar panels fixed on the ground. With our calculations, if you move the Vilaya Emergency more than twice in its lifespan, which is around 20 years, it makes more economic sense to go for Vilaya Emergency if you think you're going to move it more than twice. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I'm aware of time and I want to leave time for questions. There's 5 standardized power ranges of both emergency and community. 7, 14, 21, 42 and 63 kVA. We've chosen these sizes because these are very common sizes for diesel generators. So these can be used as a direct replacement. This can function completely off grid. It can function connected to the grid if the grid is available but not very good, and it can also function with a genset, and we can prioritize. It's completely plug and play and maintenance free. It comes with a 2-year warranty which we can extend to 5 years. And because it's productized, we have a very, very reduced lead time rather than designing each thing from scratch. So one of the things I'd like to focus on just for a minute is, and I'm happy to share more information on this at a later date, is the battery storage system we've got. We are using sodium nickel batteries in this solution, which are hot batteries with an internal temperature of 270 degrees centigrade, which means there are no temperature derating effects on usage, which you get with lithium batteries and lead acid batteries. Sorry. And when they're not in use, they're completely inert, so there's no derating in storage. Next slide, please, Madeline. So here's a summary. One of the things I didn't mention just now is that our EcoStruxure remote monitoring and control. Our EcoStruxure for energy access platform is something that is in our core business activities of Schneider Electric, which we've ported into access to energy. It means that we can control and monitor at distance the pool of assets, the pool of vilaya that you have installed. So we can see what's happening real time, wherever they are. We have communication via GSM network, via satellite networks as well. We host it on our cloud, and you can have access to that. The vilaya compared to genset is very, very cost effective. We're looking at around a 3 to 5 year return on investment, with a very low total cost of ownership. There's no maintenance or very little maintenance. There's no moving parts like a generator. And because it's standardized and modularized, like the Toyota Hiluxes I was talking about earlier, you can have a centralization of spare parts and also training. Next slide, please. Thank you. Right, so in the remaining, I think I've got around about 6-7 minutes left. I'd like to talk a bit about the financial analysis, because I'm sure there's probably going to be some questions around this. So next slide, please, Madeline. Just some general information about the comparison between pure genset, pure solar, and genset hybrid solutions. In terms of energy availability, gensets around 95 to 100% depending on fuel availability and the reliability of them. Solar is 90 to 95. We can get very close to 95 nowadays. And obviously a hybrid, you can get very close to 100%. Genset, we all know, is very high in terms of pollution, CO2 levels, health issues, noise. Solar, we have very low pollution. There's the manufacturing aspect of it, which is very similar to a genset on the other industrial manufacturing, and the battery recycling. But that can be reduced in terms of using these sodium nickel batteries, which are very environmentally friendly. In terms of CapEx and OpEx, a genset is very low on CapEx, which is why it fits well with the current budget models, but very, very high on OpEx, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Whereas a pure solar solution is high on CapEx and low on OpEx. So you've got some main advantages and disadvantages there. Obviously, the disadvantage of genset is the OpEx and the pollution, and the disadvantage with the solar is the CapEx. And then with a hybrid, you have somewhere in between the two. With our hybrid systems, we can generally go so that you would only be using your generator around 10% of the time if you used it with our solar solution. Okay. Next slide, please, Madeline. I want to give you now a financial comparison between a vilaya community and a genset, But before I really get into that, this slide shows you, this is based on World Bank data, the average or the fuel costs in 34 sub-Saharan Africa countries over the last 20 years. And you can see year on year, we have a linear increase of around 3.5% in fuel costs. Okay, and today we're at about $1 per litre. And this is price at the pump. And we know that to get into our field operations activities, by the time you've accounted for evaporation, shall I say, transport, etc., we can multiply that figure by about 1.5. And the reason I wanted to show this slide is so you can see the overall trend in the last 20 years, and this is the trend we use in our forward projections as well. And I think that is actually conservative, knowing the way we are moving in terms of sustainability generally, and that fossil fuels are going to more likely increase in cost over time. So 1.5 times I think is fairly conservative. In some areas I've seen it as high as twice the pump price in capital cities. Okay. Next slide, please, Madeline. So if I dig into this financial comparison now, I've taken a 14 kVA Vilaya community and I've compared it versus a genset 14 kVA. A few things before I get into the actual numbers is that in the bottom left here is that I'm assuming the annual inflation rate of around 3.5%. This is basically on the fuel consumption. This is using the genset in the optimum conditions, which is at around 75% loading, only for 18 hours a day, and replacing it every 5 years. So this means that if you get 5 years out of a genset in the conditions we're talking about, it's good going. And 18 hours a day means you're going 6 hours each day without any electricity. The figures include all maintenance, recycling and scrapping costs, both for Vilaya and for the genset. What I haven't included in here is any of the CO2 savings in terms of valorization of those. For Vilaya 14 kVA, using the standard UN calculations, you're going to be saving around 3,600 tons of CO2 per year, equivalent to a genset running. And it doesn't include any transport or installation of the Vilaya or the genset to site. We know that they can both be taken on a lorry, both be put in place and up and running very quickly. And that's not included because it depends on where you're going to put it. These are variable costs which I can't account for. So you can see the Vilaya in year 0 in green. We've got a very high capex cost, which I mentioned. That's around $75,000 US. And you look at the genset capex, and it's $8,000. But then you look at the graph, and by the time you factor in the fuel costs for year 1, you're up at over 30,000 US. And then as we go on, after the first 5 years, our OPEX costs for the Vilaya is around 10,000 US, because all we're dealing with is basic maintenance. Whereas the genset, you're dealing with the maintenance plus you're dealing with fuel consumption. So you're going to be burning in the first 5 years around 140,000 US dollars worth of fuel. These are manufacturers' figures and what we've also seen in the field. And this is using the genset in optimum conditions. So the total cost of ownership in the first 5 years of the Vilaya is around $85,000, as a genset is nearly $150,000. And over 20 years, we can see that the total cost of ownership of the Vilaya is around 20% of the genset, with a break-even point of around 2.8 years. Okay, so, and then the other thing I wanted to point out, what you've got here is this blip on year 13 on the Vilaya, and that is when we're replacing the sodium batteries. There's an investment to be made there at year 13, but that's taken into account in this total cost of ownership calculation. Excuse me. So next slide, please, Madeline. I think I'm nearly at the end. Yes. So if you want to know more, I've gone through a lot of things very quickly today. If you want to know more about Vilaya Emergency and Community, you can contact me. My contact details are there. I'm very happy to discuss and to help develop and to work with anybody on the financial modelling. We've got some partners already that we're starting to work with. If you want to know more about the other access to energy product and solution portfolio, how we can valorize CO2. If you want to know more about the training aspects, we have experts here, people who are focalized solely on that. I can put you in contact with those people at Schneider Electric and you can understand what we're doing in that field. And also on the EcoStruxure for energy access platform. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope I'm to time and I'd happily take any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Super stuff. I think I'm particularly interested in the Vilaya options, both the community and the emergency one. They look super compelling, and I think the from what I know about this the nickel sodium batteries, they're really well, not cool. They're hot, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, we've had a few questions come in, but I'm going to start with one of my own actually. Just whereabouts in the world have you already rolled out the Vilaya solutions?
We've got 8 deployed in Francophone Africa through an organisation called UMOS Saber, and we are also currently working with some of our system integrator partners in Nigeria, where they will take our designs. They are trained by us, they're Schneider partners, and they will use them for their project work as well. Okay, and just so you know as well, we are industrializing. This solution was designed here in France, but it's being industrialized in one of our factories in Schneider Electric, Kenya, in our factory in Nairobi. Okay.
So somebody working in Francophone Africa, would they maybe be able to go and take a look at one of these things if they were particularly considering it?
Yep, we can do that. And the other thing also, if anybody's based in Europe, we have one of these here in France. We've actually donated one to the local university here on the university campus for the students to study it as well. Okay.
Fantastic. So other questions. You talked about local partnerships early on. Can you talk about what role your partners play relative to engagement with international NGOs, installation and maintenance of power solutions, for example?
Mm-hmm. We've got a presence, as I said, in over 100 countries, and we're often based. Our presence is often based in central locations in capital cities, etc. We have, I think, in Africa, we have, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we have 4 what we call our solution centers, where we actually manufacture. We have manufacturing capabilities where we can assemble, etc., and distribute and offer after sales. And we can also offer after sales anywhere we have a presence. But around that, we have a network of Schneider Electric trained partners. That means they've come to a certain standard that we insist upon in terms of work, safety, installation, etc. And those partners can be system integrators in their own right, where they take our solutions and they build the solutions themselves, or they can be installers. And those installers will go and make the installations, as I said, to our standards. And they're the ones who are really going to the last mile for us. I'll give you an example. One of the projects I did in Uganda was we used a partner from Kenya to actually physically take the equipment across into Uganda and make the installation for us. So we have this web, this structure of partnerships that are validated by us to make sure that we have as far a reach as possible. And we are always onboarding new partners, particularly in the renewable sector, because it's a growth sector. Africa, for example, is a very strong entrepreneurial spirit, and there are many new system integrators and solar installers springing up, and we validate them, we bring them up to our standard, and we integrate them with us.
Okay, no, that's great. And then just a sort of a follow-on question, really, in terms of these things, once they're installed by the partner, what level of technical skill is required locally just to run it and do basic maintenance? Like what would we need in-house?
I think the main thing you need in-house is for somebody to clean the solar panels periodically. Other than that, because we have our EcoStruxure platform, we can see at a distance exactly what is going on with that Vilaya unit. We can see if there's a problem with one of the inverters, one of the charge controllers. We can see if the energy provision is down or is showing a trend of moving downwards, in which case it's probably solar panel cleaning. We can see if there's, compared to another asset in a similar location, if there's more energy consumption somewhere than elsewhere. I think on local level, what we would do, if there was a sufficient volume, if there's a few of these in a location, we would engage with a local partner to make sure there was second line support. We would also train local staff, so the people who are alongside it, to do that first level of intervention. And our solutions inside, they're down at board level, where we can train somebody in a central location and say, okay, so that when they go to site, because these things are modular, when they open the doors of the container, they know what they're looking at. Everything looks the same as what they've been trained on. So it's very easy for them to swap out a card or something like that. Okay.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. I'm going to bring in Mark Hawkins has found his way to raise his hand. So I'm going to bring Mark in to ask his question himself.
Sure.
I've unmuted you, Mark.
Right. Okay, well, first of all, John, thank you very much for that presentation. It was really good. I've been around this energy debate for a number of years now, and and what you've actually brought to the table was a real good, summary of the issue, but also a lot of potential solutions. And particularly, I was kind of I drew a bit of inspiration from your comparison with the Toyota Hilux thing, because that reminds me, many years ago, donors were kind of just moving out of this capex thing and sort of saying, we don't want to pay for your vehicles anymore. So actually the NGOs were finding the money to buy the vehicles and then kind of leasing them back to the projects. So this actually sort of falls into the sort of the asset pool model, which I think could work. But to make all these solutions work in the NGOs, I think we're going to need to have the equivalent of a fleet manager actually controlling electricity provisioning in the NGOs. That's the only way we're going to make it a success. And certainly within Save the Children, I think this is one of the things that I'm going to start advocating for, and actually using the fleet management as an argument. But on the technical sort of side of things, your approach, high quality kit, the design is good, the sustainability, you've ticked all the boxes, and I think I'm going to look forward to having hopefully a lot more discussions with you and other actors in the years ahead.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm very happy to hear that we're on the same page with this, and the way we're heading at Schneider is going to meet your needs. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We had a couple of questions come in about partners and geographic distribution. Basically, how would NetHope members locate a partner? Would they do that through Schneider, or I mean, how do you find out who to get this stuff from?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're a global organisation. I would advocate in the first instance coming via me, because I'm in the Access to Energy programme. I can, depending on where you are geographically, I can put you in touch with the local Schneider team or the local partner, the local Schneider partner, depending on whichever one is applicable. We have dedicated Access to Energy teams in South America, in Africa, Anglophone and Francophone, as I said, and also in Asia Pacific, in India, Indonesia, Philippines, all across the region, all the places where you guys are working. We have Access to Energy representatives and people who know these offers, know these solutions. Okay.
Thanks, John. Thanks. So I mean, your contact details are shared in the chat, and we'll be sharing them later in the landing page on the Solutions Center, so people can follow up with you. So the technical question. Oh well, so you did answer one of the questions around the monitoring tools, and then Mark Hawkins was talking about having somebody centrally to manage it. How much expertise is required to use the monitoring tools? Is it something that that organisations would be able to do in-house or in conjunction with yourselves, or and is it a service? Is that like an additional service that we pay for, like with a sort of annual licensing?
Yes, it's based on annual licensing. Obviously, in access to energy terms, and I didn't say this at the beginning, but in all our access to energy projects, we work on very different business constraints or business than our core activities and Schneider's core activities. Our profit margins and everything like that are very much lower than our core activities, but we get to leverage all of the benefits of working for Schneider and all the technology benefits. So our EcoStruxure energy access platform is very simple. We have different layers of granularity, depending on how far you want to go. We could offer training to an organisation. Organisation X wants to deploy these all across Africa, for example. Okay, we will offer training. It's also one of those things that's very interesting to train somebody in the finance, in head office finance, so that they've got an overview of what their assets are costing. If we're talking about energy as a service here, or an asset pool, where those assets are particularly deployed at the moment. So it's hosted on our cloud. It's totally secure. We would have access to it as well, only for the maintenance side, and also to monitor if we saw there was a problem, or you saw there was a problem, you could alert to us. We could log in and check. We could alert our after sales, etc., etc. So in answer, it's a web page. It's very graphical, and yeah, I think with probably an hour's training, most people would be absolutely fine with it.
I mean, at some point in the future, maybe you'll be able to showcase it to us. I mean, we do love our dashboards here at NetHope.
Yeah, sure.
No, thanks for that. Okay, so another question. So does the Velaya product is sort of geared towards emergency response, although it's not particularly well. I mean, it's portable, but it's not sort of something somebody could carry on an aeroplane with them. Mm-hmm. So for the first responders, I'm wondering whether you have any solutions that would help for the sort of first people that turn up in an emergency.
In terms of in terms of several kilowatts, it's obviously the Velaya, but when we're talking about really first landing on the ground emergencies, we have a range of solar lanterns called Mobia, which are very, very robust and are waterproof, shockproof, etc., etc. We have master purchase agreements with UNHCR for that particular product. We also have universal solar powered USB charging stations, because one of the things we see as well is that in times of emergency, people want to be able to recharge their telephones. The grid's off and they've got no way of communicating with people. Often the base stations are still active because they're independently powered, or they have backup diesel generators, but people can't charge their phones. We've also got small solar home systems, which can be deployed very quickly. And one thing about the Velaya, the 10-foot containers can actually be taken, and even the 20-foots can be taken on transport plane. 10-foot containers can be lifted by helicopter. So although it's not as portable as a diesel generator, it can be deployed. And in situations where I mentioned hurricane situations, we know unfortunately that we're getting affected by more and more hurricanes year on year because of climate change. And we know that they are going to hit the Caribbean most years. We have in our mind that we should be deployed. These things should be deployed in those locations. They can be used throughout the year, and then to power other activities. And then in terms of crisis, when we know a hurricane is coming, we can roll up the solar panels, close the doors on the container, wait for the hurricane to pass, we open the doors, and then we're up and running again in a few hours. So we've got a renewable asset that lasts for 20 years that we can use again and again and again in these kind of crisis situations.
Thanks, John. I'm looking through the questions. I think you've covered them all. Some of them came in while you were giving your presentation and got answered later, and then we've covered them now. Yeah, I just wondered if anybody else that's in the audience wants to try raising their hand and perhaps ask a question. Perhaps people can't find the raise the hand button. Okay, well we're coming towards the top of the hour. We've had I mean, I think that was a great presentation. I think, you know, Schneider is very much on the same page as many of our members around their approach to this, and obviously you've got a great focus in the areas of the world where we operate. And that we're all trying to deliver change in. So, you know, really, there's some great alignment there. And so I'd like to thank you very much, John, for your presentation. I hope to welcome you back in the future, where maybe we can dive into some detail of some of these solutions and stay involved with different things that NetHope's doing.
No.
So, yeah, thanks very much, John.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, everyone at NetHope, for the invitation and also for hosting me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's important that for us, it's important for me that we collaborate. It's important that we get the message out. It's important that we understand your needs. It's important that we put in place proper models where we can create this shared value, where we can create economic development around the activities that we're doing. I will be at the NetHope conference, and I look forward to meeting a lot of you in person. And please contact me by mail in the meantime if you have any questions. I'm happy to put you in contact with local teams. I'm happy to give you any information that you want. And again, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to meeting some of you face to face and potentially doing another webinar in the future. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So yes, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a landing page for this webinar on the NetHope Solutions Center shortly. And if you signed up for this online and had an invitation, then we've got your address and we'll send you details of that. Ask if you could fill out the short webinar poll that we have put a link to in the chat window. I think it's the third one that's appeared there. The ones before had space in. So yeah, please give feedback if you like this or if you didn't like this. And as ever, we welcome any suggestions for webinars that you may be interested in. So thanks very much, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John and Duncan.
There's an awkward bit at the end.
The pause. That was brilliant, guys. We had 20 attendees here.
I actually counted yeah, there were about 20, not including NetHope people. A couple of people dropped in, and